My father looked at my 7-year-old son sitting beside me with an empty plate and said, "You should have packed him something." My sister's children were already eating expensive steaks while Caleb quietly picked up a dinner roll from the bread basket and tried not to look embarrassed. I felt something inside me go completely cold. I looked at my father, smiled, and said, "Noted." Then I called the waiter and ordered Caleb the same steak everyone else was eating, along with mashed potatoes and the biggest chocolate dessert on the menu. I asked for a separate check for my son and me. My mother immediately leaned over and said, "Sweetheart, you'll still split the main bill with Travis, won't you? Your father's on a fixed income." I looked around that table and suddenly realized I was done. If you've ever been the person in your family who always pays, always helps, and somehow still gets treated like you're selfish, stay with me, because this dinner was only the beginning. What I discovered afterward involved my credit, my parents, my sister, and a secret that had been hidden for years. If you enjoy stories where quiet people finally stop accepting unfair treatment, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me because the revenge at the end was more satisfying than anything I could have planned. My name is Sophie Sinclair. I'm 34 years old, a pediatric nurse, and a single mother raising Caleb. I'd spent years working night shifts, saving money, and quietly helping my family whenever they needed it. My father had undergone bypass surgery 4 years earlier, and afterward I'd started sending my parents $400 every month for his medication. Nobody officially told me to keep paying forever. It simply became expected. I had also co-signed a $38,000 SUV for my sister Madison because my mother promised me it was only a formality and Madison would make every payment herself. For years, I accepted those responsibilities because I thought keeping peace was worth the cost. I wasn't rich, but I'd managed to save $28,000 toward a little blue house on Alder Street, 6 minutes from Caleb's school. It had a crooked porch and an old oak tree in the backyard. The first time I showed Caleb the house, he pressed his hands against the window and asked which bedroom would be his. I already knew. That house was supposed to be our fresh start. Then, 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, my loan officer Dana called and asked me to come to her office. She told me underwriting had found 2 problems. The first was Madison's SUV, which was 90 days behind on payments and had damaged my credit. I was angry, but I thought I could fix it. Then Dana showed me the second problem. There was a Visa account in my name with a balance of $9,400. I stared at the screen and told her I didn't own that card. The account had been opened 4 years earlier, and the billing address was my parents' house. The recovery number was their landline. The payments had been made perfectly every month. Someone had opened an account using my identity and had carefully maintained it for 4 years. That night, I pulled my credit reports and checked the transaction history. The card had been used for groceries, pharmacy purchases, my mother's salon appointments, and family dinners. Then I saw Harlan's Chop House, birthday dinners, Easter, family celebrations. And then I found the charge from my parents' anniversary dinner, the same dinner where my son had been given a bread basket instead of a meal. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that the steak my family had refused to buy for my 7-year-old might have been paid for with a card carrying my name. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house with the paperwork. I placed the credit report on the kitchen table and asked my mother what it was. She read the pages without looking surprised. Then she took off her glasses and calmly said, "Your credit was the best in the family, so we put it where it would do the most good." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, you opened a credit card in my name." She didn't apologize. Instead, she pointed out that not one payment had been late. When I told her I was trying to buy a house and needed my credit cleared, she actually laughed. "Sophie, you're an investment. Investments are supposed to pay out." That was the moment I finally understood that my family didn't see my sacrifices as favors. They saw them as obligations. I walked out without yelling. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply took my folder, closed the door behind me, and sat in my car for several minutes. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to keep my family happy. I was thinking about how to get my name back, protect my son, and make sure nobody ever treated our place at the table like something we had to earn. And as I started the car, I realized I had no idea how much deeper their little family accounting system actually went. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and my mother's words repeating in my head, "You're an investment. Investments are supposed to pay out." I kept thinking about that sentence because it explained something I'd never been able to name. My family didn't simply ask me for help. They had built an entire system around the assumption that I would always be the one who gave and everyone else would be the one who received. The next Sunday, my mother invited me to dinner, and I went because I needed answers. I also wanted to give them one last chance to fix everything without lawyers or police reports. I arrived with a simple plan. My parents would take responsibility for the $9,400 credit card and transfer it into their own names. Madison and Travis would refinance the SUV and remove my name from the loan. I would stop the monthly $400 payment, and everyone would simply start carrying their own responsibilities. I thought it was reasonable. Apparently, in my family, asking everyone to pay their own bills was considered an attack. Travis was the first to complain. He crossed his arms and told me refinancing would be ridiculous in the current market. Madison immediately started crying and asked how I could possibly consider putting our mother in a police report over a credit card. My mother didn't even defend herself. She just sat there quietly while everyone else explained why I was the problem. Finally, she looked at me and said, "This family doesn't sign papers against each other." I almost laughed. There were already plenty of papers with my signature on them. The difference was that every one of them seemed to benefit somebody else. I told them I wasn't trying to destroy the family. I was trying to protect my credit and buy a home for my son. My mother shook her head and said I was being dramatic. That's when I realized they were never going to voluntarily give me back what they'd taken. So I decided to find out exactly how much of my life they had been keeping track of. My father kept important documents in his study, and because I was still the daughter everyone trusted, I still had a key. A few days later, while my parents were at church, I went into his study and found the folder containing Madison's SUV paperwork. I found the missing page I needed, but underneath it was something else, a green cloth ledger with worn corners and a strip of masking tape across the cover. On the tape, in my mother's handwriting, was one word: household. I should have closed the drawer and walked away. Instead, I opened it. The first pages went back decades. Expenses were carefully listed with dates and amounts. My braces, my school clothes, driving lessons, gas money when I started nursing school. Even small amounts had been recorded. But what stopped me was the next column. Some entries had interest added to them. My mother had apparently been keeping track of what she believed I owed from childhood. Then I found Madison's pages. Her wedding expenses were there. Cheerleading, clothes, apartment deposits, car payments. But beside most of Madison's expenses was one word: gift. I turned back to my own pages and saw the difference immediately. My expenses were debts. Madison's were gifts. Then I reached the newest pages, and my hands went cold. The heading wasn't Sophie. It wasn't Madison. It was simply the letter C. Caleb. His school shoes were listed. His birthday bicycle. Gifts my parents had given him. Things I had always considered loving gestures from grandparents were sitting in that ledger as expenses they expected someone to repay. My 7-year-old son's red bicycle had a price beside it. His shoes had a price. Every little thing they'd given him had apparently been entered into the family accounting system. I closed the ledger and sat there in silence. Suddenly, my father's words at the restaurant made sense. "You should have packed him something." It wasn't really about the meal. In my mother's mind, Caleb had already received enough from them. He was another account that needed to pay back what had been spent on him. I put the ledger exactly where I found it. I didn't take pictures. I didn't need to. The credit reports and bank records were enough. The ledger had given me something more important than evidence. It had given me an explanation. My family hadn't been keeping score because they were greedy. They had been keeping score because they genuinely believed love was supposed to be repaid. That night, I called my Aunt Lorraine, the only relative who had never asked me for money. I asked her if she knew why my mother treated family like a financial ledger. There was a long silence before she asked, "You found the book, didn't you?" Then she told me about my grandmother. When my mother was 16, my grandmother made her put half of every paycheck into a glass jar. She called it rent. Meanwhile, my mother's younger brother received help without having to repay anything. My mother had spent decades believing that being useful was the price of belonging. For a moment, I felt sorry for her. I could see the 16-year-old girl standing at a kitchen sink, watching her brother receive everything she had been denied. But then I remembered Caleb's name in that ledger. I realized that understanding where the cycle came from didn't mean I had to continue it. The next morning, I canceled the $400 monthly transfer to my parents, froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, and formally disputed the Visa account. I didn't call my mother to warn her. I let the bank handle it. 3 days later, she called me furious because the money hadn't arrived. "You forgot Dad's medication transfer," she said. I looked at my phone and quietly answered, "No, Mom. I didn't forget." That was the first time I understood what a real boundary felt like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply a decision that didn't require anyone else's permission. 2 days later, my mother showed up at my apartment holding an envelope from the bank. She looked furious. "You reported your own mother," she said. I told her I had reported an account I never opened. She stared at me as if I had betrayed her personally. Then she lowered her voice and warned me that if I continued, I would lose my family. I looked at her through the doorway and realized that for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that threat. I was afraid of what would happen if I gave in. Because Dana had already called with the deadline. The bank would only protect my mortgage application if I filed a formal identity theft affidavit and the police report. Without them, the disputed balance could remain attached to my name, my debt-to-income ratio could fail underwriting, and the little blue house I'd spent years saving for could disappear. So I had 10 business days to make a choice. I could protect my family by sacrificing my future. Or I could protect my son and finally make my family responsible for what they had done. And I already knew which choice I was going to make. The affidavit sat on my kitchen table for 3 days. I would look at it before work, after work, and sometimes in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep. The hardest part wasn't admitting that my mother had used my identity. I already knew that. The hardest part was accepting that protecting myself meant putting her name on a form. My entire life, I had been taught that family problems stayed inside the family, no matter who had caused them. But every time I looked at Caleb, I remembered that the consequences of staying silent wouldn't stop with me. Then the pressure started. My mother called repeatedly. Madison sent emotional messages, and relatives began telling me I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding. Nobody asked why a credit card had been opened in my name. Nobody asked why Madison's SUV was 90 days behind. They only wanted me to make the problem disappear. One cousin even called me paranoid. I didn't respond. I had finally realized that explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me was another form of paying a debt. Then the collection agency called my workplace. I was standing at the nurse's station when my charge nurse handed me a message about the delinquent SUV. My face burned with embarrassment. Madison had apparently listed my work number as a reference, and now her financial problems had followed me into the one place where I had always kept my personal life separate. I called the agency back during my break, gave them my employer's policy, and demanded that all future communication be in writing. I wrote down the confirmation number and hung up. For once, I didn't feel powerless. I felt organized. That evening, I told my friend Ruth everything. She listened quietly while I explained the credit card, the SUV, the ledger, and the pressure from my family. When I finished, she looked at me and asked one question. "What are you more afraid of losing, Sophie, your family, or your position inside that family?" I couldn't answer immediately. I'd spent so long being the reliable daughter that I couldn't separate myself from the role anymore. Ruth nodded and told me something I'll never forget. If being loved requires you to keep paying, that's not love. That's a contract. The next morning, I went to the Millbrook Police Department and sat across from Detective Alan Marsh in the Financial Crimes Unit. I told him exactly what had happened and asked what filing a report would actually mean. He didn't threaten me with dramatic consequences. He explained that a report didn't automatically mean my mother would be arrested. In family identity theft cases, The matter could potentially be resolved through restitution and legal agreements. But there was one thing I couldn't avoid. If I wanted the investigation to begin, I had to name the person who had used my information. My hand hovered over the affidavit when I got home. The name belonged in a small box on a government form, but writing it felt like cutting a final thread. I thought about my mother at 16, putting half her paycheck into that glass jar because she'd been taught that love had to be earned. I understood her history now. I even felt sorry for her. But then I remembered Caleb's name written in that green ledger, and sympathy stopped being an excuse. That weekend, my father ended up in the emergency room with chest pains. Madison texted me that he was there, and for a moment I forgot everything else. I drove straight to the hospital. His tests were reassuring, and the doctors believed it was anxiety and reflux rather than another heart attack. I stayed beside him anyway. Around 2 a.m, he woke up and held my wrist. In the quiet of the hospital room, he finally told me the truth about my mother. He remembered the jar from when she was young. He knew about the way she had been raised. He knew exactly why she believed every family member owed something back. Then he looked at me and said, "She doesn't know another way to love you." I wanted that sentence to fix everything. It didn't. I could understand my mother without surrendering to her. I could recognize where the behavior came from without allowing it to reach Caleb. Pity explained the past, but it couldn't pay my mortgage, repair my credit, or erase what had already happened. Later that night, my mother found me in the hospital waiting room. She sat beside me and gave me one final offer. If I withdrew the dispute, paid the $9,400 myself, and resumed my monthly contribution, she promised the family would move on. She even said I could continue attending family dinners as long as I stopped making everything about money. Then she lowered her voice and told me that if I filed the paperwork, I would lose my family and Caleb would lose his grandparents. That was the moment I knew the answer. She was still using my son as leverage. I looked at her and asked whether she had ever stopped to calculate what the family owed me. She stared at me as though the question didn't make sense. Then she said, "I paid my mother until the day she died. I never complained. It's your turn." I almost laughed because she had finally said the quiet part out loud. It wasn't about love. It was about inheritance. She had inherited a debt and expected me to inherit it too. I went home before sunrise and sat beside Caleb while he slept. He was wearing his dinosaur pajamas and holding the same stuffed stegosaurus he carried whenever something bothered him. I had barely touched his hair when he opened his eyes and asked, "Mom, are Grandma and Grandpa mad because of me? Because you bought me the steak." My heart broke. A 7-year-old child was already wondering whether he had cost his mother something. I sat beside him and told him he had done absolutely nothing wrong. I told him nobody had to earn a place at our table, and nobody was allowed to make him feel like a debt. He listened carefully, nodded, and went back to sleep. I stayed there for a long time, watching him breathe, and finally understood exactly what I was protecting. The next morning, I signed the affidavit. My hand didn't shake. I wrote my full legal name, signed the document, and had it notarized. Then I put the paperwork into my purse. I wasn't trying to destroy my mother. I wasn't trying to get revenge. I simply wanted my name back, and I wanted my son to grow up believing that love was something freely given, not something entered into a ledger. But I still had one thing left to do. My mother's deadline was approaching, and my father's birthday dinner had already been scheduled at Harlan's Chop House. The exact same restaurant, the exact same table. And this time, I knew exactly what was waiting for me there. Saturday night came, and I drove to Harlan's Chop House with Caleb sitting quietly in the back seat. I had the affidavit in my purse, and for the first time, I wasn't going there hoping my family would understand me. I was going there because I had already made my decision. The same long table beside the fireplace was waiting for us, but something was different. A kid's menu had already been placed in front of Caleb, crayons were sitting beside it, and Madison greeted us with a smile that felt almost rehearsed. My father looked healthier after his hospital scare. Travis was wearing another expensive watch, and my mother watched me from across the table with the calm expression of someone waiting for a transaction to finish. The dinner itself was strangely normal. Nobody mentioned the credit card, the police report, or the SUV. Madison talked about Harper's school, Travis complained about traffic, and my parents discussed the restaurant's new menu. Caleb ordered his steak without hesitation, and that small moment meant more to me than anyone at that table understood. The last time we'd been there, he had been given a bread basket. This time, he had a real menu and nobody questioned whether he deserved to order from it. I watched him eat and reminded myself why I had come. After the plates were cleared, my mother tapped her spoon against her glass and announced that she had a gift for me. She handed me a cream-colored envelope tied with a gold ribbon. For one foolish second, I wondered whether it might actually be an apology. Maybe she had finally understood. Maybe she had written something that admitted what she'd done. I opened it and my stomach tightened when I saw the title across the page. Family Repayment Plan. My mother had prepared a contract. The document demanded that I withdraw the bank dispute, accept responsibility for the $9,400 balance, restart my monthly family contribution at $500, and continue supporting the family financially. In return, Caleb would have full family access, meaning holidays, birthdays, and visits with his grandparents. There was even a signature line at the bottom, already dated. My mother smiled and pushed a pen toward me. "Sign it, sweetheart," she said. "Then we can put all of this behind us." I looked at that document and realized she hadn't learned anything. She had simply redesigned the same cage. I picked up the paper and looked at my mother. I didn't shout and I didn't insult her. Instead, I told her that I knew about the green ledger. I told her I knew about the jar my grandmother had made her contribute to when she was 16. I knew that half of every paycheck had gone into that jar while her brother received things without paying for them. I told her I understood that she had inherited a system where love was measured in sacrifices, and every sacrifice eventually became a debt. My mother went completely still because she knew I was no longer guessing. I understood her history. Then I told her the part that mattered. But the jar stops with me. I explained that I wasn't going to shame her or expose her entire history to the family. I wasn't even asking for revenge. I simply wasn't going to pass the debt down to Caleb. My mother immediately became angry and accused me of being ungrateful. Madison started crying, and Travis told me I was taking things too far. But I stayed calm because there was nothing left to prove. I had spent my entire life explaining myself. That night, I only needed to make a decision. I told them that Monday morning I would file the affidavit and police report. I explained that I wasn't demanding that my mother be arrested or punished. I needed the credit card investigation to begin, and I needed my name removed from the debt. "That isn't revenge," I said quietly. "It's arithmetic." "You're kind." My mother stared at me as though she couldn't believe I was actually going through with it. Then she told me I would lose my family. I looked at Caleb, who was still eating his steak, completely unaware that adults were trying to turn his place at the table into a bargaining chip. I placed the unsigned repayment plan on the table. Then I took out enough cash to pay for my meal and Caleb's and left it beside the salt shaker. I wasn't paying anyone else's bill. I wasn't arguing over who owed what. I was simply paying for what I had ordered. Before leaving, I looked at my mother one final time and said, "The ledgers are closed." Then I helped Caleb into his jacket, hugged my father, and walked out of the restaurant. Outside, my father followed me into the parking lot. He looked tired, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he finally admitted what I had always suspected. He knew what my mother had been doing. He had seen the ledger. He had watched the family system grow around her and had chosen silence because confronting her felt harder than allowing me to carry the burden. "I can't stand up to her," he admitted. "I should have a long time ago." It wasn't the apology I'd wanted as a child, but it was the first honest thing he'd given me in years. I told him I loved him, but I still had to protect Caleb and myself. Monday morning, I kept my appointment. I submitted the affidavit and the police report, and for the first time in my life I signed a document that was entirely about protecting myself. There was no shaking hand, no second-guessing, and no apology afterward. The investigation would determine what happened next, but my part was finished. I had finally stopped trying to convince my family that I deserved fairness. A few days later, Dana called me with news that made me sit down on my kitchen floor. The bank had accepted the dispute provisionally and suspended the $9,400 balance from my liability while the investigation continued. Underwriting had also accepted the documentation, which meant my mortgage application could move forward. The little blue house on Alder Street was still possible. After years of saving, sacrificing, and paying for everyone else, I was finally going to buy something that belonged only to me and Caleb. Then Madison called.
Her voice was different this time.
No tears, no anger, no accusations. She simply asked, "Did Mom really have a ledger?" I knew immediately that something had changed. I told her the truth. I told her that her pages were marked as gifts, while mine were treated like debts, and that Caleb's name had eventually appeared in the same book. Madison went silent. She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. She was standing at the beginning of a truth that had taken me 34 years to understand. 3 weeks later, I received the keys to the little blue house. Ruth helped me move boxes, and several nurses from the hospital came straight from their shifts to help carry furniture through the front door. Caleb's dinosaur bed went beneath the east-facing window, exactly where I had imagined it. When the morning light came through the curtains, he stood in the middle of his room and smiled. For the first time, there was no family ledger, no repayment plan, and no invisible price attached to anything in that house. My father came by on moving day and stayed for only 20 minutes. Before leaving, he handed Caleb a $20 bill and looked around to make sure nobody else was watching. Then he leaned toward my son and whispered, "Don't tell Grandma and don't write it down." Caleb nodded, seriously, even though he didn't understand the meaning behind the words. I watched my father walk away and realized that sometimes people don't know how to fix the past. Sometimes the best they can do is make sure they don't repeat it. That evening, Caleb and I sat on the front porch of our new home. He asked if we could have pancakes the next morning, and I told him he could have whatever he wanted. He smiled and leaned against me. I looked at the house, the crooked porch, and the old oak tree in the backyard, and I realized something simple. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply stopped paying for my place in it. And for the first time, Caleb and I were sitting at a table where nobody could ever hand us a bill for belonging. By the time the investigation was finished, the truth was impossible for my family to hide anymore. The credit card had been opened using my information, the charges had been made by people living in my parents' house, and the bank records showed exactly where the money had gone. Madison's SUV was also refinanced without me, which finally removed my name from the loan. I didn't celebrate when it happened. I simply sat at my kitchen table, looked at the letter confirming that my credit was being restored, and realized that the revenge I'd imagined wasn't really revenge at all. The most satisfying part was knowing that I had finally stopped carrying consequences that belonged to other people. My mother still refused to apologize. For months, she told relatives that I had chosen money over family and that I had abandoned my parents when they needed me. Some people believed her. Others didn't. I stopped trying to control the story. If someone wanted to believe that I was selfish because I refused to let my family use my identity, they were free to believe it. I had spent too many years trying to make everyone understand my intentions. Now I cared more about what Caleb understood when he looked at me. Madison eventually called me one evening and admitted that she had known about the credit card. She claimed she hadn't realized my mother had opened it without my permission because she'd assumed I had agreed to it years earlier. I asked her one simple question. If you thought I had agreed, why didn't anyone ever tell me? She couldn't answer. Instead, she started crying and told me that Mom had always said I was the responsible one and that I would never let the family struggle. I told her that being responsible didn't mean being available for exploitation. She apologized, and although I accepted the apology, I didn't immediately rebuild the relationship. Forgiveness didn't require me to reopen the door. My father was the first person from my immediate family to visit the new house regularly. He never asked me for money again. He brought Caleb small gifts, took him fishing, and respected every boundary I set. One afternoon, he stood in the kitchen while Caleb was outside playing and told me that my mother had finally stopped keeping the green ledger. She had put it in a box and given it to him. I asked what he planned to do with it, and he said he didn't know. I told him to throw it away. He smiled sadly and said, "I think she needs to." A week later, my mother called and told me she had burned it. I expected to feel victorious when I heard that, but I didn't. Instead, I felt tired. That little book had controlled my family for decades, but burning it couldn't erase what it had done. What mattered was that Caleb would never grow up believing that every kindness came with an invoice. He would never look at a birthday present and wonder how much he owed. He would never sit at a family dinner with an empty plate while adults decided whether he deserved to eat. And he would never have to earn his place beside me. 6 months after moving into the house, I received the final approval on my mortgage and stood on the porch holding the paperwork. The old oak tree moved gently in the wind, and Caleb was riding his bicycle in the driveway. I watched him circle the house and thought about how close we had come to losing it. If I had listened to my mother, I would have paid the $9,400 credit card balance, continued paying for Madison's SUV, resumed the monthly family allowance, and probably spent years believing I was doing the right thing. Instead, I had finally learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish when the people around you have made a habit of taking advantage of you. That night, Caleb and I had dinner on the porch. Nothing fancy. Just burgers, fries, and chocolate milk. He looked at me and asked, "Mom, are we rich now because we have our own house?" I laughed and told him no. Then he asked, "Are we poor?" I shook my head and told him we had something much better. We had peace. He didn't completely understand, but he smiled anyway. I watched him take another bite and realized that peace was worth more than every dollar I had ever spent trying to buy approval. I still see my parents sometimes. Holidays are smaller now, and there are no shared bank accounts, no surprise expenses, no envelopes waiting for me at family dinners. Everyone pays for their own meals. Everyone manages their own bills. And strangely enough, our relationships are healthier because of it. My mother and I aren't as close as we once were, but when we talk, I no longer feel that familiar pressure in my chest. I don't wonder what she expects from me. I don't calculate whether saying no will create another family crisis. I simply speak honestly. Looking back, the dinner at Harlan's wasn't really the moment my family betrayed me. It was the moment I finally noticed the betrayal clearly enough to stop participating in it. The real revenge wasn't embarrassing my mother in front of relatives or watching Madison struggle with her own bills. The real revenge was much quieter. I took back my name, protected my son, bought the home I had worked for, and refused to teach the next generation that love is something you have to repay. If you've ever been made to feel guilty for setting a boundary, remember this. Saying no doesn't make you cruel, and protecting yourself doesn't make you selfish. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for a family is refuse to continue a cycle that has been hurting everyone for years. My mother believed I was an investment that was supposed to pay out. In the end, I realized I wasn't an investment at all. I was a person, and so was my son. And that's the part I'll always remember. The night my family gave my child a breadbasket instead of dinner, I thought they were humiliating us. I didn't realize they were giving me the final reason I needed to walk away. So, if this story made you think about someone in your own life who constantly expects you to give more than you receive, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in my situation. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional revenge stories. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't watching someone else lose everything. Sometimes it's finally realizing that you don't have to lose yourself just to keep them happy.